words too, but okay, I'm just going to say it one more time. Today is Thursday, September 15th. This is the SIG Architecture Enhancements Subproject meeting. I'm Kirsten, your host, and the sub-project owner. I work at Red Hat, and we're just going to get started, I guess. And I'm recording, so no pressure to turn on your camera or do anything that you're uncomfortable with. And if there's anything you want to say after the meeting, also, that's something that you don't want recorded, that's fine too.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce myself. So it's Astosh, our DevOps engineer from India, and so I joined the call because I applied for the SIG release team, and I got rejected in the mail because suggested that it's better if you join the calls and give more contributions, so it will come into their notice, and next time they may allow. So yeah, I joined it from first time, and earlier I have been part of the layer 5 community. So there I joined the weekly calls of Meshri also. But here is my first time. So yeah, I would like to listen and try to understand what's going on.
Sure, of course. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Just as a little bit of background for you, and I guess it introduces the discussion. In Kubernetes, we have this thing called a KEP, a Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal, which is how new features get into Kubernetes. So basically, if Joe decides he wants to make some big change, he has to fill out what is essentially a design document that sort of tells us the technical details, the motivation, risk factors and everything, and also how he plans on rolling out the feature. So we go usually through alpha, beta, and GA. And so for the first part, he might say, okay, this is going to be alpha. Only parts of it are going to work. And this basically, this KEP, which is what this meeting is essentially about, enhancements. This enhancement is the document that anybody can look at to understand the design and maybe even just the state. So hey, like Joe did this thing that in 1.25 and it's beta. I wonder what that includes. And you can go and look at the document to also see the state of the enhancement. If it's finished, then you can also go and it'll say it's GA as of XYZ. So basically it's like a record of let's just say a feature, but it's also the design of the feature. So it's like this one-stop shop that's the place where you go to talk about and also track the progress of any feature using feature loosely in Kubernetes, if that makes sense. We'll assume it makes sense. So one of the things as background that we have them very occasionally, and they don't really actually happen that often, but we have people who want to document something that's not a technical feature with a KEP. And the problem is that a KEP is very focused on technical details and, like feature gates and production readiness review type things. And so it can be, just kind of a drag to have this really long, essentially template that you have to fill out when you want to make more of a policy change. Now, it might be a technical policy change and it might make some other policy change, but, so that's why there's this idea of what we're discussing today, which is a process KEP, which would be taking that enhancement template that we already have and tailoring it to basically a whole other set of use cases where people don't need a zillion parts of, like the technical discussion of it. But on the other hand, there are other things within that process KEP template that we also want to think about, like communication and, really understanding what the motivation is and other things that maybe we don't care as much about in sort of more technical KEP. So it's kind of a balance. And what we're discussing is kind of like, how can we start to think about this other new template that accommodates this other set of use cases without excluding use cases for a process KEP. So I think, Joe, I would just love to hear your motivation, because I feel like in my head, like your process KEP is squarely like in like one of the sort of like use cases, but it doesn't necessarily cover all of them. But I just love to hear kind of like your perspective, because you said you were in, I think, SIG API machinery and at CD. So I'd love, like, from a perspective of like a sort of SIG, I don't know if you're a lead or just like a really active member, like what you'd be looking for in a process KEP.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I kind of, Tim Hawken kind of challenged me with this idea that this was something missing. And so I went through and I looked at some some caps that are either self-declared or are kind of implicitly a process cap. And I found, there's a bunch around kind of feature life cycles. So there's, one about preventing perma-beta features of features. There's one about beta APIs going off by default, which is just going in now. There was another one that introduced the concept of prod readiness. And they all had a couple properties in common, which was they didn't require any code changes into the core repos of Kubernetes, right? So like no code changes at all. It's literally entirely about process, and you can enact that process at like a reasonable time, but it's not really bound to the release cycle. So, like prod readiness, you just pick, hey, in the 126 release or 123 release or whenever it was, this is going to be a required thing. And like once you enact that and say when it's going to start being activated, it's just kind of done. And you don't really need to like deal with feature freezes and stuff when you're introducing a process like a process cap, right? Because you're not putting stuff into the repo. The release team doesn't really need to track your thing as part of something that's going to go out into a Kubernetes release. And so I thought those were all kind of like some of the interesting constraints about like how you differentiate a process cap from like a more like typical cap. And then also if you just go through like how the de facto process people have kind of like found for themselves to do this, they trimmed off a ton of sections on the cap. And that's super useful because it's like right now everybody is kind of individually trying to figure out which ones to trim off whenever they do this. But if we just show them like, no, these are all the ones that don't apply for sure, that I think that makes their life easier. So there's kind of this reduction stuff that you can do where like you just take out a bunch of stuff. But then I also started to notice there was like a misalignment too, like where some of the sections kind of applied, but it wasn't quite the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Concept.
It's different. It's kind of different. Like, yeah, because I actually had started working on like thinking through the process cap and started on like a template. And that was the thing is like, yeah, totally agree. Like we should have a process cap, but also think that it has to be kind of opinionated about what we're looking for, because otherwise, right, like if we just like take out parts of a template, then it's kind of leaving like certain sections up to the person where it's like, yeah, give me some details, but I'm not telling you what kind of details they are, like whatever it is. So it's actually kind of like once you go through the reduction step, then there's like I started like doing this like addition step, and then I'm like, oh, okay, well this is just like this is an equally, not equally long, but it becomes equally long because at least to me, like part of the process cap is communication, and like how can we and tell me what you think, right? But I already talked about this in another meeting.
I think you're further than me, so I'm really interested in this part.
Yeah, so for me, part of it is communication, because we also have a process cap like the cadence cap, which, like that's like, because there's different levels of how does this cap affect people? And then how much do you want to rely on the thoughtfulness of the author versus like a sort of a framework in how you have to communicate decisions or changes? Like, I think that for, like the no perma beta thing, like that was all like announced well in advance. And, like the authors of that like had a good idea of the impact of their change, right? But you could also foreseeably have people who make a big process change that's actually like, has a high impact as opposed to like a lower impact. And they don't give anybody any advance warning. They just write their cap, approve it. And, even I could even see like within a SIG or something, they don't really give a lot of, heads up for that. And it could be really disruptive to contributors or users or, downstream projects or anything. So like, yeah, it's kind of a rabbit hole when you start like to classify kind of the types of caps that you could have and their impact. I'm like trying to finish up the draft that I had. Like it's totally janky, but like as a kind of jumping off point for conversation, because I have like a lot of janky ideas in there that I would love for you to comment on. Like this idea of like tracking impact and scope of the cap, right? Because it's like if something impacts just your SIG, and it's not even that disruptive for your SIG. There's no reason why you can't just say like, hey, maybe this goes into effect like right now. Maybe you're using your process kept to document something that already exists, right? Like you're just like, I just want to write this down because we already do it this way, right? But then maybe you're doing something that affects the whole project or really affects the users or really affects something else where, we kind of need that handbrake in there where it's like, okay, but this impact is really high. And we want to make sure that you're going to like adequately get commentary on these changes from whoever's impacted and also give them plenty of time to understand what the change is. Because we've been relying, I think, for a lot of the processes on kind of just like the knowledge of the authors, which, SIG architecture, they are very like understanding of that, but it doesn't necessarily, I think apply for everyone. So yeah, there's like all of these, it's like a little onion of processes. That's a way of saying that.
There's a couple of things in there I really like. There's one that I hadn't gotten a chance to really kind of think through and write up much about, which is like, I think we need to be very clear on what the communication is going to happen once it's ratified, right?
Exactly,
So like,
exactly.
If this process goes through, we need to really understand who you're going to, and that makes it so much easier for the next process kept author because they can look at a previous process kept and look at the communication plan that was established, and they can just kind of incrementally improve on that. If we don't do that, everybody has to figure it out from scratch all over again.
But also it's like almost like, I feel like it's almost mandatory. Like that's the thing, right? It's like for a regular KEP for the audience, like for a regular KEP, the proof that your KEP is done and that the thing happened is that, like all of the associated PRs close, right? And somebody looks and they're like, all of the PRs closed, or they didn't, they're getting backed out or whatever. So this is officially now this, right? And you did your documentation and you might have done X, Y, Z else. But the process KEP, it's kind of like, there is that kind of risk of like, yeah, like this is a big change and we're totally gonna, do so much communication, and then they don't, or it's like super janky, and then you're like, wait, but you actually like you sent out one email like the day before holiday and nobody saw it or something, like a week before this thing takes place. I don't know. So yeah, there's definitely like I think the KEP is kind of powerful because there's that follow-up action to verify that the thing happened that you said was going to happen.
I think we can basically encode the expectations and kind of like the normal process here. And I mean, if I was going to write a process KEP, I would be super thrilled to have that because it's like, okay, so first I propose it, and then everybody agrees on what we're going to do, and it gets probably, I don't know, we pick words. Maybe the word for that is ratified, and then you go through the process of like enacting it. Which is like you do all the communication, you mark that it's all communicated. You probably then have to transition the KEP once more to like now it's fully enacted. Right?
Exactly. Like, so that's totally like what like in my janky draft so far, like that's what I was doing. Because like that's kind of the part that actually, because it's like really tempting to just like strip out the annoying parts of the KEP template and then be like, oh, here, like, but then that also like potentially creates a lot of unintended consequences, like because it's like, okay, cool. That's why when I saw yours, I was like, yeah, I think this accidentally creates like a lot of policies that we don't want to like actually create. So yeah, I mean, I think that like I think maybe what I need to do is like de-jankify my draft a little bit and put it up. It's like, but the thing is I don't know that it's like great for a PR. I mean, I could just do like a Google Doc for now or something just to have like a conversation with people about it. But
yeah, probably, I mean, that's what I usually do in an early phase when I do standard KEPs is I start with a doc and I just kind of live with the mess a little bit. I try and get a bunch of ideas out there and just accept that like, it's going to be messy and complicated. And then one of the nice things about that is then like once I feel that people are starting to like narrow down on the key topics and I'm getting the sense of like where the final shape of this might start to trend, then I can then like write a KEP where I sometimes copy paste sections over and sometimes rewrite sections, but I kind of recreate a new document.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cause like that's what I was struggling was like, okay, like I am working on this template, but there's like all of these conversations and like input from people that I want, but I don't actually want to put up the template because that's kind of not the point, right? It's like the point, like it's like kind of like, no, like there needs to be like a sort of semi-discussion or just feedback about like certain ideas. And sometimes like a PR is not the best place for it, which is why I really wanted you to like come to the meeting, because I was like, I have a lot to say, but it's not going to come across like right on a PR comment. Like,
and this one's going to be, I mean, the funny thing about is when we eventually do write a CAP for this, which is kind of inevitable, we're going to want it to be in the form of the
I
process
know.
CAP
I
is
started,
proposing.
that's why I struggled too, because I was like, I can't use the regular CAP for this CAP, but then this CAP isn't done.
No,
So
it's
there's
gonna
no
be
point of
like,
writing a CAP. So you almost have to write the template first. And maybe with like the pre-note conversation document, like eventually use that in the CAP. But yeah, I had these thoughts too. I feel so much better.
yeah, so because that's all going to have to happen, we're going to be in this kind of silly flow where like we're going to be defining something, not using the process that it's proposing, but which it clearly should adhere to.
Yeah.
So we're going to just have to have some mess somewhere until
Yeah.
we're like
Okay. Yeah.
ready to like merge it into this final form.
Okay. I feel so much better that someone else like felt this pain, because I was like, I almost got sidetracked by it, because like when I was doing this template, I actually started writing like just comments in there and like prose, because I'm like, well, like, like this is what I think about this and that and this. I'm not necessarily like wedded to this specific wording, but this is my intention. So yeah, maybe that'll be on my big to-do list, is to kind of dump it all into a document and share it, because I think that that's a better kind of venue for like discussion and not even thinking about the final form. But to me, it's like goal oriented, right? It's like you want a clarity of why people are doing it, what they're doing, like the impact of it, who it affects, and then how they plan on, I mean, the biggest part of it, right, is like, how do you plan on actively like informing people that this is happening? And like the
I think the
communication is
communication's
big.
huge. And the other thing that I noticed is right now people are individually figuring out how to do this from scratch. And I mean, they kind of converge a little bit on certain things, but it's a lot of work for people to like, oh, I'm trying to introduce a process. People are recommending I use a CAP, but CAPs aren't for that. So I'm individually just trying to restructure the CAPs into this, but I'm not really sure what's right. And then I go over to like the YAML file and I don't know what the states mean and I don't know which ones to strip out. So I think there's kind of like 2 or 3 parallel goals here. One is to collectively decide how this works instead of individually deciding how it works. Another is to improve and standardize and like, learn from each other on like what the communication processes should be. And then probably the last one is to like leave a much like better trail of history of like what decisions were made, how they were made, who agreed on it, and all that.
I think actually that number 3 is
those,
really good. Like I hadn't even considered, I was like stuck on like kind of like 2 a lot, but I think 3 is actually like, this is kind of a record, like this is because even like if you look at some of the existing process CAPs, they're kind of like, you kind of understand it, but then you kind of don't necessarily have like all of the context sometimes too. So I think this is, that's actually a really
it'll
good
be a huge
point.
time saver. Somebody comes and they're like, why did we do this? And then like if the CAP is completely an unconvincing reason on why we did this, then like we need to update the CAP. Well, I mean, we will update it. So what will probably happen is we'll have a big set of big kind of messy ideas, and we'll all kind of like collab on that for a while. And a lot of things will come. And then what we'll probably have to do is condense that into the first iteration of the actual process template. And we'll probably have to like, anything that we're not super sure on, we'll have to kind of either phrase very carefully or admit from now, and then we'll just have to let that thing grow over time.
I mean, I think like how people start, I think like if we have the right sections and guidance, like I've just noticed in a lot of, I mean, not every, I've seen a lot of CAPs in my day, but I feel like it's like there's like a good set of people where if you give them just like the headings and the guidance, they give you like a lot of information. And so like those people I'm not worried about. It's more just like the outliers where you're like, yeah, but this is a process. So I really have to make sure that these outliers who only write like one sentence have the right
Mhm.
sentence at least. I don't know. Like, but yeah, I like those 3 points and kind of figuring out like, yeah, I mean, I do think that part of the final I think that part of the final template too though will have some I like because I kind of looked at it also through like impact, like how many like not how many people, but like what is the general impact? Like is it just like, just memorializing something, or this isn't a big deal, like it's like a low impact to the contributors or whoever, it doesn't
Mhm.
affect any users, it only affects the SIG already talked about this like 1,000 times? Or is it something where it's like we need like 5 SIGs talking about this, we need like we need like all of like, so it's also like kind of like a scale question, so there'll probably be more like not optional sections, but I feel like you need more detail the greater the impact is, especially for communication and probably like rollouts and things. It's like the rollout of the idea really is the one that
Mhm.
starts to get kind of complicated, because if it's like a SIG and a SIG is like, yeah, I decide not architecture, but somebody else, like I decided this and everybody in the SIG agrees and we're all going to do this from now on and it's totally fine. Like, I mean, like that's a pretty like standard like thing to decide to do and then do
Yeah.
it. But if it's like, hey, we're changing the Kubernetes cadence, or hey, like we're changing how we do APIs and things. And I think like SIG architecture did a really good job, like, making sure to like space those things out by letting people know a good period of time in advance, and then kind of like cranking it to like, okay, well now it's this. But how do you kind of memorialize that? But that's like a high impact change as well, So
Mhm.
I think like impact plays sort of a big role in the expectations of like the rollout and how long that might take, and the notice that needs to be given to people, like
Mhm.
notice
Yeah.
it's like the impact is kind of the core of like, or scope is kind of the core of like, well, how much notice do you have to give people? And I don't think there are rules, but there should be guidance, how much feedback do you need, right? Like if you're going to
Yeah.
change everything, then maybe your KEP needs to be open for, X period of time, and you have to solicit some feedback from all of the disparate groups. Where like if it's just your SIG, it's a little bit more straightforward. So yeah. I'm gonna put
Yeah.
this in my document, in my messy document
Yeah.
to be shared.
Yeah. It's tricky because some of them are very procedural, and it's like we're going to add this process and it's not super contentious. But I also noticed that some of the things that I had listed as being an example of a process cap were almost more of a policy cap.
Yep.
And some of those, you could imagine some of those getting incredibly contentious, like where you have like two sides, both with a strong perspective.
Yeah.
And so I don't know.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
But it's
I
at
don't
the
know how to
same
deal with
time,
that.
like our KEP isn't like, I feel like it's like our KEP's not telling people how to make a decision, right? Like I don't tell, like I'm a sub project owner for the template, but I don't tell
Mhm.
people like this is how you decide that you're doing this feature, right? Like I
Yeah.
can't tell you how you agree upon something or not, or how you resolve your disagreements or not. But I do say that, or we do say that you have to have an agreement, like you have to
Yeah.
like have these people from the SIG or the other SIG, there's like 5, maybe there's 3 SIGs involved, they all have to approve this, whatever approved
Mhm.
means to them. So yeah, I think that's like a kind of like, you want the space to do that. That was why even just when you open a new KEP and you open an issue, which you didn't do this actually, Joe, but when you open a new issue, like you're supposed to put a discussion link where someone from the SIG said, like, this is
Oh,
a
yeah,
good,
I didn't have that yet.
right. But the idea, and it actually just as background, it helped us a lot because you previously just had tons of people opening KEPs in the repo and never talking to the SIG, and then having this awful process. So it's like, I don't tell them like what I don't say like, what do I need to see in that discussion? I'm just like, you need to discuss it and somebody needs to say, yeah, do that. Right. So I think like we can lightly make space for those agreements and discussions, but I don't think we have to say like what agreement is, right? Like, or like what that has to really look like, because there is like an approval process on a KEP, just a process KEP, just like a regular KEP, right? Like, so,
Yeah.
you know, maybe it's like, if you enumerate the impact, then, you know, different people need to also approve that KEP, like different SIGs maybe, or different whoever's, like if it's going to require a lot of communication, maybe you need a sign off from, I don't know, SIG contributor experience or something, that they're going to help you do whatever, you know, something like that. So I don't think we have to say what approval looks like. I think we just have to make space for that actual approval to happen in a way.
Yeah. I got to jump to another
Yeah,
meeting.
yeah, no problem. I'll thank you for coming. This was really
Yeah.
helpful, and I'm gonna make my like junky document and share it like in the next
Awesome.
week. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I'll jump on that.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for being here. And if you have any questions, I'm Kirsten, Kiki's Delivery Service. You can just reach me on Slack.
All right.
Bye.
Good to meet you.
You
Bye.
too.